Hi everyone, my name is Fraser Maguire. I'm a young trade unionist and socialist, and I would really like to welcome everyone to this event tonight discussing Lenin on Ireland, the decisive blow against English imperialism. Today's forum is the latest in the Lenin 100 series, which has seen thousands of you register for talks on Lenin's theories of imperialism, the economy, and more. Please do watch back previous events, register for future ones, and buy a ticket for the whole season if you can. You can use the links provided in the YouTube chat below. Today's discussion on Lenin and Ireland is an interesting topic at an important time when United Ireland is now very much on the agenda, and we need to make sure that it's being put firmly on the British left's agenda too. Lenin was undoubtedly one of the most brilliant minds ever drawn to the international socialist movement, an outstanding theorist, practical and meticulous organizer who had innovative ideas in a number of key areas, including, as we're going to see today, areas of anti-imperialism and anti-colonialist thought. Overall, in this series, we're aiming to look at Lenin's dynamic revolutionary ideas, how he worked as part of a larger collective, how he centered the labour movement, and his radical understanding of democracy. And we have to look at how this can help transform and develop our activism and political organising today. At a time when this understanding of imperialism is very much needed, I'm really pleased to be joined by Joe Dwyer, writer of a forthcoming book on Lenin Ireland, aptly named Lenin Ireland and the Politics of National Liberation. Joe Dwyer studied at the University of Liverpool's Institute of Irish Studies until 2016 and spent a semester of his second year studying at the University of Galway. He also holds a degree of Bachelor of Arts with honours in Irish Studies and Politics, contributes regularly to Sinn Féin's quarterly magazine and the accompanying online journal I Nua. He's also been published in Peace, Land and Bread, Labour Briefing, and his writings have been featured on the online platform Labour Outlook. Like me, he's a member of Unite the Union and lives just outside of London, where he serves as Sinn Féin's political organiser in Britain and the office manager for the party's London office. Joe is going to take us through some of what Lenin had to say on Ireland, how it inspires Irish socialists, and what remains relevant for us today in our struggle for a better world. If you can, please do look at donating at the link provided by our friends at Arise Festival, who have very kindly lent us their YouTube channel today. And most importantly, buy a ticket for the whole of the Lenin 100 series to help cover our costs, as online events like this aren't cheap to put on. You can use the links provided in the Q&A, and please let us know where you're tuning in from as well. Joe, I'm going to pass over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for a very kind introduction. And to the organisers of Lenin 100 and our good friends of the Arise Festival for the invitation to speak. I've warned the organisers that I'm not a public speaker, and I'm far from being an expert on these things. I'm an enthusiastic amateur, but I appreciated that I was asked to speak, and I think it's important that we are getting Ireland as an issue onto these platforms and discussed, and I value that the decision was taken to ask me to say a few words about Lenin and Ireland. So to begin, I'd begin by quoting Marx, which isn't a bad place to start. So on December 10th, 1869, Karl Marx wrote to Friedrich Engels, "The English working class will never accomplish anything before it has got rid of Ireland. The lever must be applied in Ireland. That is why the Irish question is so important for the social movement in general." Now, this foundational observation is fairly key to understanding Lenin's appreciation of Ireland. From roughly 1912 onwards, Lenin was beginning to consider the nature of imperialism, and with it, the conundrum of the national question. Through his study, Lenin began to anticipate that the national question would be of exceptional importance in the time ahead. Indeed, Lenin has been characterized as the first major political theorist, Marxist or non-Marxist, to grasp the importance that anti-imperialist national movements would have for global politics in the 20th century. In the run-up to the October Revolution, it's estimated that he penned close to 100 studies and articles specifically considering the national question, ultimately recognizing the national liberation struggles in the oppressed nations could aid the collective struggle against international capital. Thus, not without its warnings and its caveats, there was revolutionary potential in cooperation and shared struggle with the petty bourgeois nationalists and in conjunction with the proletarian masses. His analysis of the national question extended beyond the nationalities that existed within the Russian Tsarist Empire and focused as much, if not often more so, on places like Ireland, China, India, and the wider Middle East. And in his considerations, Lenin repeatedly, when you look at his texts, he repeatedly returns to Ireland and to what Marx and what Engels said about Ireland. By this stage, when he was considering the question of imperialism, he'd already become fairly disillusioned with the Second International. He'd begun to question the wisdom of Karl Kautsky, who was known as the supposed Pope of Marxism during this time. So he returned back to what Marx said, and picking up where Marx left off, Lenin recognized that Ireland's national struggle was not only essential to the advancement of socialism in Britain, but, and this is where he probably advanced on Marx's initial theory, Lenin came to the conclusion that Ireland provided a vital and a necessary model for the broader struggle against global imperialist capitalism. Indeed, as he wrote in early 1914, the policy of Marx and Engels on the Irish question serves as a splendid example of the attitude the proletariat of the oppressor nations should adopt towards national movements. It is an example which has lost none of its immense practical importance. Now, obviously, Karl Marx was writing at a time before the epoch of imperialist capitalism. Neither Marx nor Engels lived to see the full realization of the age of imperialism, an age that Lenin would later define as the highest stage of capitalism. However, as Lenin notes in his work on imperialism, there were two important distinguishing features of imperialism that were already present in Britain before capitalism had reached the monopoly phase. Namely, Britain already enjoyed vast colonial possessions and a monopolist position in the world market. Indeed, Eric Hobsbawm once defined the epoch of imperialism as a period when something that was once purely a British phenomenon became commonplace amongst the imperialist powers. Therefore, Ireland, as England's first colony, was of vital consideration because Ireland was also one of the first countries in the world to develop a national movement and a culture of anti-colonial resistance. Having said that, undeniably, you have to acknowledge that, like many colonized people, the Irish played a role in Britain's imperialist project, whether as settlers or soldiers or administrators. However, it's equally true that Ireland quickly established itself as a locus of anti-colonial practice over intermittent periods. The Irish people rose to resist both English and Scottish colonists who implanted themselves, often forcibly, onto Irish soil. So, as Lenin noted, by the turn of the century, the centuries-old Irish national movement had passed through various stages and combinations of class interest before it finally began to manifest itself with the Easter Rising in street fighting conducted by a section of the urban petty bourgeoisie and a section of the workers after a long period of mass agitation, demonstrations, and suppression of newspapers. So the forms of revolutionary and cultural activism developed by the Irish against the self-interest of rule by the British aristocracy meant that Ireland became a standard bearer for all anti-colonial movements in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So whereby Marx had observed that the advancement of the English working class depended on applying the lever in Ireland, Lenin extrapolated on that theory and proposed that the advancement of the international working class depended on applying the lever in the oppressed nations of the world. Now, the oppressed nations still included Ireland, but crucially, they also included other colonial conquests around the world by the European imperialist powers, and the so-called backward nations, which was a term used at the time in many of the texts. This was a fairly astute observation by Lenin. He was recognizing that the 20th century would be one defined by anti-imperialist struggles and led by anti-imperialist struggles. And it was primarily because when Lenin sat down to seriously consider the national question between 1912 and 1916, one has to recognize that Europe lacked any recent example or experience of national revolution. So in his search for contemporary examples, Lenin focused his analysis on China's 1911 revolution, Iran's revolution between 1905 and 1911, and Mexico's revolution from 1910 onwards. His study of these contemporary revolts culminated with his 1913 article, Backward Europe and Advanced Asia. And as Vijay Prashad has noted, the article's provocative title stood as an open admission that no energy for rebellion seemed available in the United States or Great Britain, in France or in Germany. But there's a crucial caveat, and that caveat is except in Ireland during the 1916 Easter Rising. So as Prashad notes, Ireland was a standalone exception in all of Europe in this respect, and accordingly it could be posited that Ireland, at least from 1916 onwards, constituted an advanced revolutionary corner of backward Europe, rather than being a backward nation. Now, I'd be far from the first person to have spoken about how Lenin advanced on Marx's original theory. If you look at the work by George Lukács, he notes that while Marx was among the first to recognize that the exploitation of Ireland was on the one hand an important bastion of English capitalism, which was already at that time uniquely monopolist in character, and on the other hand, that the ambiguous attitude of the English working class to this issue divided the oppressed and provoked a struggle of exploited against exploited, instead of a united struggle against their common exploiters. And therefore only the struggle for national liberation of Ireland could create a really effective front in the English proletariat struggle against bourgeoisie. Even though Marx had theorized this, his prescription had remained frustratingly ineffective, not only within the contemporary British labour movement, but also within the theory and practice of the Second International. So ultimately, in the words of Lukács, it would take Lenin to instill new life into the theory and make it a more active, more concrete life than even Marx had given to it. And this is why Lenin was one of the few social democrats in Europe to recognize almost immediately the importance of the Easter Rising. James Connolly's daughter, Nora Connolly O'Brien, she tells that just before her father's execution, James Connolly had confided to her, my socialist friends on the continent will never understand why I'm here. They will forget I am an Irishman. And James Connolly's concerns were well placed. This was a time when many leading social democrats viewed the supposed national question as a bourgeois distraction from genuine class struggle. And even within more radical Marxist revolutionary circles, the appeal of national liberation was often rejected as inappropriate, as un-Marxist, and as counter-revolutionary in some instances. So in this atmosphere, George Plekhanov, who was one of the earliest exponents of Russian Marxism, entirely dismissed the Easter Rising as positively harmful. Karl Radek, who was a young Bolshevik theorist who was then exiled in Switzerland, he wrote a lengthy article where he argued that the petty bourgeois adherents of Sinn Féin had been seduced by nationalist dreams, and he further argued that the rising amounted only to a push that the British government easily disposed of. 2 months later, this opinion was echoed by Leon Trotsky, who was living in France at the time, and he similarly dismissed rebel leaders as nationalist dreamers and suggested that the historical basis for a national revolution has disappeared even in backward Ireland, before adding the experience of an Irish national rebellion is over and done with. Back in Britain, perhaps unsurprisingly, the reaction was equally poor and arguably more chauvinist. Tom Johnson, who was the editor of the left-wing Scottish publication Forward, which was a newspaper that James Connolly had regularly contributed towards and appeared in, he wrote that a man must be either a nationalist or an internationalist, and therefore the psychology of the rising is a mystery to me. The editor of the Herald, George Lansbury, who was a man who was generally sympathetic towards the cause of Ireland, he wrote that the rising was a crime against the British people and summarised that no lover of peace can do anything but deplore the outbreak in Dublin. The British Socialist Party condemned the rising as foolish, and the Socialist Review, which was the theoretical journal of the Independent Labour Party, in its editorial stated, in no degree do we approve of the Sinn Féin rebellion. Even at home, among the Irish left, some former comrades of James Connolly criticised his participation in the rising. Sean O'Casey, who had only recently resigned as the secretary of the Irish Citizen Army, would later remark that Connolly had stepped from the narrow byway of Irish socialism onto the broad and crowded highway of Irish nationalism. So, as has been said, there was at least one socialist on the continent who undoubtedly understood Connolly's motivation, and that was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, best known by his pseudonym Lenin. As Peter Beresford-Ellis has summarised, only Lenin seems to have completely grasped Connolly's position. And Lenin's response to the Easter Rising it's characteristically direct and full-throated in his response. He was incensed by Karl Radek's description of the rising as a pushed. He noted that the term pushed in its scientific sense could only be employed when the attempt at insurrection revealed nothing but a circle of conspirators or stupid maniacs and aroused no sympathy among the masses. So Lenin, therefore, in his article, continues to argue that whoever would call such a rebellion a pushed is either a hardened reactionary or a doctrinaire hopelessly incapable of envisaging a social revolution as a living phenomena. He adds to that to imagine social revolution conceivable without revolts by small nations in the colonies and in Europe, without revolutionary outbursts by a section of the petty bourgeoisie with all of its prejudices, without a movement of the politically non-conscious proletarian and the semi-proletarian masses against the oppressions by landowners, the church, the monarchy, against national oppression. To imagine all this is to repudiate social revolution, arguing that it would be a fundamental mistake for socialists to expect a scenario where one army lines up in one place and says, we are for socialism, and another somewhere else says, we are for imperialism, and that will be social revolution. Only those who hold such a ridiculously pedantic view could vilify the Irish rebellion by calling it a pushed. And furthermore, he argued that whoever expects a pure social revolution will never live to see it. Such a person pays lip service to revolution without understanding what revolution is. So he came out fairly robustly and defended the Easter Rising. If he had any critique, it was only that he felt that the Irish had the misfortune to rise prematurely before the European revolt of the proletariat had had time to mature. But even with his critique, and some people overplay this critique, he was very quick to clarify that it is only in premature, individual, sporadic, and therefore unsuccessful revolutionary movements the masses gain experience, acquire knowledge, gather strength, and get to know their real leaders, the socialist proletarians. Or to quote James Connolly's maxim, no man can swim until he has entered the water and failed and been half drowned several times in the attempt to swim. So like Connolly, Lenin had grown up under the boot of empire, albeit at the opposite bookend of Europe. The two men were of a similar age. Connolly was born in the slums of Edinburgh in 1868, while Lenin was born just 2 years later in Simbirsk, now Ulanovsk, on the Volga. And as the political biographer of James Connolly, C. Desmond Greaves, memorably wrote, that Connolly's thought ran in parallel with Lenin's can almost be shown phrase by phrase. This is undeniably true when you're reading both of them at the same time. Indeed, in one section of the book I'm currently editing, I'm trying to trace where and how their thinking lined up specifically by juxtaposing the most pertinent quotations from both men. Indeed, the historian Charles Townsend has gone so far as to suggest that Connolly anticipated Lenin in his acceptance that the force of nationalism might begin the revolution, which could ultimately open the way for socialism. And although Lenin would often couch his observations with a more avowedly social democratic expression compared to Connolly's Hibernicized Marxism, it's undeniable that the two men were reaching similar conclusions at the same time, albeit interdependently. The notion that revolutionary consciousness could develop in the colonial peripheries of the capitalist powers would go on to become a cornerstone of Lenin's theory of imperialism as the ultimate stage of capitalist development. Subsequent to the October Revolution, Lenin would advance this program in material terms, this program of an international proletarian revolt brought about by the national struggles of the subject colonial peoples against the European imperialist powers. Indeed, he would later refer to the distinction between the oppressed and the oppressor nations as the cardinal idea that separated his Third International from the Second International. Under the Third International, there was a new categorization of the national revolutionary movement, which was conceived to recognize the reality of this revolutionary activity taking place in the oppressed nations. This designation replaced the previous designation of bourgeois democratic. Further to this, Lenin directed that at the Second Congress of the Third International, that this slogan, proletarians of all countries and oppressed peoples unite, be adopted. Now, strictly speaking, that's a notable departure from the original declaration of Marx and Engels. But as Lenin is quick to highlight in the debate, the Communist Manifesto had been written at a different time completely. And using Marx and Engels and their writing on Ireland specifically as his guiding light, Lenin advanced that global liberation of the oppressed nations had to receive equal attention as the liberation of the proletariat. Now, with all this in mind, one has to ask why there's been precious little attention afforded to Lenin's writings on Ireland. As Kevin B. Anderson remarked in 2007, of the several lengthy studies of Lenin published since 1970, mainly by British scholars, they either do not mention Lenin and Ireland at all, or they give the topic short shrift. We're often reminded of Engels' reply to Karl Kautsky, if you ask me what the English workers think of colonial policy, it's exactly what they think of any policy. It's the same as what the middle classes think. And this was a phenomenon that Lenin encountered himself. In May 1920, he receives a delegation of British workers for a personal interview. But the visit leaves him considerably frustrated, as he later writes, When I told them that every decent English worker should desire the defeat of the English government, they understood nothing. They made faces that I think even the best photograph could not capture. They simply could not get into their heads the truth that the interests of world revolution, workers must wish the defeat of their own government. And arguably, I would suggest that this blind spot towards Ireland is part of this broader chauvinism that continues within the British left. It's telling that the anthology collection Lenin on Britain, which was first published in 1934 and later reissued in 1941, and this collection carries some of Lenin's most critical works on Ireland. In neither the 1934 preface nor the 1941 preface, both of which were written by Harry Pollitt, is there any mention of Ireland whatsoever, even in passing. Now, there were some notable exceptions to this blind spot from the British left. In 1931, Modern Books published Marx, Engels and Lenin on Ireland, which was written by the English communist Ralph Fox. Fox would later give his life fighting fascism in Spain. But beyond that, references to Ireland are rarely to be found in most English texts on Lenin or Leninism, for that matter. I mean, I can attest to that because I've spent most of a year combing through them all, looking for fragments of them. As the literary critic Willie Malley once rhetorically asked, given the historical failing of the British left towards Ireland, he asked whether closer scrutiny of Lenin's writings might have helped inform a clearer understanding of the picture. This is a sentiment that recalls Sam Porter and Dennis O'Hearn's compelling argument, which appeared in the July-August 1995 edition of New Left Review. The British left's failure on Ireland stemmed from a widespread intellectual and practical malaise within the ranks of the British left, a malaise for which there is no moral excuse. I also believe that there's culpability on the part of many historians, and even the best Irish historians are guilty of this. Very often, Ireland's independence struggle is siphoned off away from any broader consideration of the international struggle against imperialist capitalism. Ireland's struggle against British colonial hegemony is typically presented entirely as a domestic affair. And for too long, what Lenin said, what Marx said, what Engels said in relation to Ireland has gone undervalued and underappreciated, or at minimum, it's been treated as a cursory interest or a niche area of study. As Edward Said noted, the problem of Irish liberation is so often not regarded as being an imperial or nationalist issue. Instead, it is comprehended as an aberration within the British dominions. I would argue that Robert C.J. Young is correct in his introduction to post-colonialism, when he argues that among many post-colonialists, Ireland tends to be regarded, as always, as a somewhat marginal case, but in many ways, its role has been central at both a theoretical and a historical level. Now, we know from Lenin's notebooks that he took a personal interest in following Irish affairs. He wrote about the Dublin lockout. He wrote about the machinations around the formation of the Ulster Volunteer Force and the Curragh Mutiny. In 1915, he made notes on reports of an attempt made against the life of Roger Casement while Roger Casement was in Norway. He noted down the Irishman's hatred of Britain when he read a copy of the Irish American newspaper, the Gaelic American. It's been said that he possessed a copy of Michael Davitt's The Fall of Feudalism in Ireland. That copy was said to be personally inscribed to him. And more than that, it's undeniable, as someone who resided in London intermittently on 6 occasions between 1902 and 1911, it would have been nearly impossible for Lenin to avoid mention of the Irish question. This was a time when the affairs of Ireland constituted one of the longest running conundrums in international affairs and political discourse. As Winston Churchill famously observed, how is it that she, Ireland, has forced generation after generation to stop the whole traffic of the British Empire in order to debate her domestic affairs? Certainly, Lenin's wife, Krupskaya, recalled that she, her husband, and a London companion attended an Irish nationalist meeting in London addressed by John Redmond, who was the then leader of the Irish Nationalist Party. We also know that Lenin spoke at a roundtable discussion in February 1910 to consider the Copenhagen Congress of the Second International. And we know that meeting was also attended by the Irish writer George Bernard Shaw. We know that Michael Collins, who would later become a guerrilla leader in the Tan War in Ireland, and Collins was an avid fan of Bernard Shaw. We know that he would later boast that he had seen Lenin speak in Ireland. And furthermore, we know that at the very least, Lenin was aware of James Connolly's book, The Reconquest of Ireland, published in 1915. The work appears listed in Lenin's notebook titled Gamma. It's listed under the heading References from English Sources. Now, this notebook was compiled between 1912 and 1916 and contains much of Lenin's preparatory material, his preliminary notes, and his structural plan for his work, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Despite its inclusion in his notebook, there doesn't appear to be any direct trace from Connolly to the final text. This could be unsurprising, as Lenin does complain in his introduction to Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, that he suffered somewhat from a shortage of French and English literature. And it's not entirely clear whether the reference list is books he was trying to source or books he was using. We do know that James Connolly's son, Roddy Connolly, who attended the Second Congress of the Third International in July 1920, Roddy Connolly reported that Lenin was entirely unaware of Connolly prior to the Easter Rising. However, based on their conversation, the Bolshevik leader had since read Connolly's Labour in Irish History, and that he told Roddy that he considered Connolly to be head and shoulders above his contemporaries in Europe. A similar testimonial is provided by Maxim Litvinov, who was the first Soviet representative to Britain. In a meeting with a delegation of Irish communists in 1918, Litvinov reported that both Lenin and Trotsky were conversant with the writings of Connolly, and that Connolly's name was favorably known to the Russian revolutionary movement. This would correspond with Leon Trotsky's letter to Nora Connolly O'Brien, daughter of James Connolly, from 1936, in which he wrote, "The tragic fate of your courageous father met me in Paris during the war. I bear him faithfully in my remembrance." Cathal O'Shannon, who was part of the Irish delegation that met Litvinov, would later reflect how it was a great pleasure for us to hear him speak of James Connolly. As he spoke, I thought of how Connolly's heart would have rejoiced at the success of the Bolsheviks and how he would have handled the new situation. On closer inspection, it's demonstrable that Lenin's appreciation of the Irish question, which was in turn informed by Marx's appreciation of the Irish question, regularly served as his anchor point for his subsequent conceptualization of imperialism. Ultimately, at least in my humble opinion, Lenin's writings on Ireland do therefore warrant dedicated and cultivated appreciation. And hopefully that's going to be realized with the collected works I'm currently working on. And I think it's particularly important because almost uniquely among the historic nations of Europe, Ireland experienced a pre-1918 revolution, and this is nothing to sniff at or nothing to ignore. As Walter Rodney advises us, Marxists have to take the subject of nationalism seriously. Marxist internationalists see nationalism as bourgeois and reactionary, based on a narrow interpretation of what Marx said. For Lenin, the role of nationalism depends on objective conditions, and his analysis is still relevant. Because when James Connolly resolved to commit his Irish citizen army to the Irish Republican Brotherhood's national conspiracy and to participate in the Easter Rising of 1916, he did so because he recognised that the Irish struggle was part of a broader struggle against imperialism. As he wrote, Ireland may yet set the torch to a European conflagration that will not burn out until the last throne and the last capitalist bond and Devonshire will be shrivelled on the funeral pyre of the last warlord. So both Connolly and Lenin recognised that Ireland constituted a fracture point for the British Empire. It was the colony from which most pressure could be exerted. Indeed, Lenin pretty much acknowledges this in July 1916 when he writes that a blow delivered against the power of the English imperialist bourgeoisie by a rebellion in Ireland is 100 times more significant politically than a blow of equal force delivered in Asia or in Africa. And in this respect, the Easter Rising was not naive from an internationalist, anti-imperialist perspective. By early 1916, many of the Eastern European nations occupied by Tsarist Russia were on the precipice of insurrection. Many of the colonies of the European empires were in open revolt, revolts that are all too often forgotten when these studies are made. For example, the German Cameroons in 1914, Nyasaland in 1915, Dahomey, French Indochina, Niger in 1916, Mozambique in 1917, as well as Chad, Egypt, India, the Ivory Coast, Kenya, Nigeria, Senegal, Tunisia, Uganda, and Libya. So in this respect, the lack of interrogation of Lenin's writings on Ireland and how they informed this broader debate around the colonial question and the question of national self-determination in general is almost inexplicable. George Padmore writes that the struggle for national liberation in the colonial and dependent countries is part of a worldwide struggle for the assertion of the exploited and the dispossessed against the status quo. It can perhaps be qualified as the manifestation of the class struggle in its acutest form, since the colonial masses are the oppressed of the oppressed. Therefore, for Lenin, the Irish question was easiest understood as a question of support for national liberation for one of the oldest oppressed nations in the world. And it's a model that he sought to replicate on a global scale. The veracity of this theory of his is arguably confirmed by the fact that since 1917, there have only really been successful socialist revolutions in the colonial and the semi-colonial countries. So in conclusion, the Irish economist Patrick Lynch once observed that Marx had understood Irish conditions well. Indeed, Lenin understood them perhaps even better. Both Lenin and James Connolly advocated for the right of oppressed nations to self-determination, emphasizing the importance of the working class proletariat to take the lead within the national movements, advancing the cause of political independence. Both men identified imperialism as a system of exploitation and oppression that needed to be overthrown through revolutionary agitation within the oppressed nations. As an Irish Republican as well as a socialist, it is understandable that Connolly's writings place particular emphasis on the specific conditions of Ireland. And in this respect, Lenin's analysis tends more towards that broader international perspective. But it was Connolly's daughter, Nora Connolly O'Brien, who later reflected how, when she heard news of the October Revolution, her first immediate thought was, if only father was alive to hear that now, how pleased he would be. While there's no ultimate way of knowing, I've always been taught and been of the opinion that your first instinct is usually the correct one. And in this respect, I think that Nora Connolly O'Brien was correct. And that is more or less where things stand and where we're at. So hope I didn't prattle on too long.
Thank you, comrade, for that absolutely fantastic presentation. I definitely learned a lot. So we've had some questions submitted as well. I'm going to read out the first two now, and if you'd like to come back to these. So the first one very much relates to that quote you opened with from Marx on the relationship between Irish liberation and Britain. So the question is, moving the discussion on to today, how could change in Ireland have repercussions in terms of change in Britain, as Marx and Lenin argued that it might? The second question we have also, I think, really looks at what you're saying about in sort of a geographical perspective of how Ireland's in a almost unique position in Western Europe for that situation it was in. And it is, what have Irish socialists taken from Lenin's solidarity with anti-colonialist movements outside the imperialist heartlands of capitalism? So those two questions, and I'll pass back over to you to answer those.
Okay, thank you very much. Two nice, easy ones. In terms of a discussion of things today, and how could change in Ireland have repercussions in terms of change in Britain, based on Marx and Lenin. Obviously, none of us have a crystal ball for these things. I've always been of the personal opinion that Irish national liberation, Irish unity, complete full independence would be a positive for the struggle in Britain. I think you can look at it in practical terms, with the immediate effect of Irish unity. If you were being cynical about it, you wouldn't have ready reserve of reactionary unionist politicians who could be called upon to shore up the worst kind of votes in the British Parliament. You have to, if you're asking how has continued presence in Ireland affected the British left, you can look at how often the Tory party relies on the unionists to bolster their position. £1 billion bung from Theresa May. You could go further back to 2008 when Gordon Brown was trying to push through 42-day detention and managed to get it through based on the votes of some fairly reactionary politics that exists because of the continued British interference in Ireland. There's also terms in which, and this was arguably more true during the most recent conflict, it's equally true in terms of low intensity arguments. The North has always been a testing ground for the securocrats and for the intelligence services in terms of surveillance, in terms of stop and search, in terms of interrogation techniques. So removing this colonial backyard where the establishment gets to practice its ways, I think that would be in the interest of the British left. And then fundamentally, it's a good thing for democracy. I think for too often, it's kind of this position of, what's in it for us? And you can go back to Lenin's frustration when he met with the British workers in 1920. Sometimes the wrong way to approach these things, because fundamentally it's the anti-imperialist thing to do. It's the British left has always struggled to decouple itself from the British state, British institutions, even the language, when you hear people on the left talking about the United Kingdom, no Democrat should advocate for a kingdom, and no socialist should insist that it remain united. You see it in terms of the British Labour Party and their parliamentarianism. It arguably filters then across to the British trade union movement. So in terms of British left outwardly, avowedly calling for Irish unity, I think it's that first structure that would upend the establishment in Britain and, really throw things up in the air for the advancement of the British left. It would be a key gain in the anti-imperialist struggle. I think it's fair to say that this isn't all, one-way traffic. I think the Irish left has stuff they can learn from the left in Britain. We're seeing it at the moment with anti-migrant rhetoric and the far right, which is rising in Ireland like never before. I think there's important lessons that can be shared both ways. But I feel more often than not, the Irish left is very keen to work alongside the British left, and the British left just doesn't consider Ireland to be an issue. So people should read Marx, they should read Engels, they should read Lenin, they should read Larkin, they should read Connolly, and they should return to these old lessons that have often gone forgotten. Now, in terms of the second question, and what have Irish socialists taken from Lenin in terms of solidarity and anti-colonialist movements? It's hard to say. There's questions of how many Irish revolutionaries. There's a question of how many Irish revolutionaries, particularly in the early 20th century, read Lenin. There's some indication that Constance Markievicz and Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, they might not have read Lenin, but they were following news reports of what Lenin said and took an interest in what he said. As ever with Ireland's story, very often the women in the revolutionary movement had the better politics, and in a different place we'd be if they'd been in more of a driving seat than they often were. So in terms of Lenin's influence, I wouldn't wish to overstate it. Certainly in Ireland, there's kind of an anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist attitude. This internationalism has always been a tenet of Irish republicanism. Neutrality was underpinned by the father of modern Irish republicanism, Theobald Wolfe Tone, with his pamphlet, The Spanish War. And with that principle of internationalism, it's genuinely fed sort of a solidarity for the underdog within Irish society. You can cite numerous examples in Irish history. The Mexican-American War, you had Irish soldiers in the American army who absconded and deserted and joined the Mexican side because they identified with that struggle as a parallel to their own struggle against Britain. The Irish rose a brigade to fight with the Boers. And some of this, admittedly, might have been motivated by anti-Britishness. My enemy's enemy is my friend. But it did manifest itself in this anti-imperialist attitude. You see it today in Ireland in terms of the solidarity for Palestine, which I like to think Ireland's been sort of doing as much as it can and kind of showing the way in terms of solidarity for Palestine and for Palestinians. If one goes to Derry or Belfast, there's paintings on the street that demonstrate a clear anti-imperialist culture and narrative of world history. Probably in more recent times, this was most clearly manifested in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, which received considerable support in Ireland, both in terms of the grassroots boycott phenomena started in Dunnes Stores, and then on a political strata where you had Kader Asmal approaching Gerry Adams, approaching Sinn Féin, and looking for organizational support in the anti-apartheid struggle. And you actually had Irish Republicans carry out attacks against the apartheid regime in South Africa, against a major oil refinery. Certainly, those who studied Lenin best and most clearly, they took that anti-colonial message and teachings and applied and recognized it in Ireland. So Fidel Castro, Nelson Mandela, both of them had an innate solidarity with the Irish struggle, and didn't shy away from speaking about it. And so despite the Irish government, very often, despite the revisionist telling of Irish history, there is a culture in Ireland that by and large, maybe I'm an optimist, I do think is anti-imperialist and anti-colonial. There was a quote I recently came across from Edward Said, where he said, there are three places that have meant a great deal to me. One is South Africa, another is Ireland, and the third is India. These places have meant a great deal to me culturally, not just because there was always a spirit of resistance, but because of it, there is this huge cultural effort, which I think is more important than arms and armed struggle. And I think that's what lasts in the Irish psyche. It's this culture of supporting the underdog and opposing the empires. That's probably what I'm finishing up there.
That is fantastic. I'm having to struggle not to make notes and fight that urge, but it's been really interesting. I've definitely learned a lot. I want to do a quick reminder to everyone watching that if you haven't, please do consider buying a ticket to the Lenin 100 series. And also look if you'd be able to register and make our next event, which is called What Lenin Would Make of the World 100 Years On, with a guest speaker, former advisor to Jeremy Corbyn, Steve Howell. I think just before we finish up, I'm going to go to one final question for you, a little bit of a more light-hearted one, but still one that I'm very interested in. Is there any truth to the tale that Lenin was taught English by an Irishman and therefore spoke with an Irish accent?
It's a good story, and it pops up on Twitter fairly often. Any mention of Lenin and Ireland, you get it. You get Lenin had an Irish accent. Lenin had a brogue. Unfortunately, from the research I've carried out, I think it's a tall tale. It's well recorded that Lenin suffered from a form of was dyslalia. He had trouble pronouncing his R's, and this often got him ribbing. There's one letter where Trotsky imitates Lenin's speech pattern. We know that he got English lessons while he was in London. We know that he placed an advert in a literary magazine requesting English lessons in return for Russian lessons. It's quite detailed work that's been carried out by Andrew Rothstein to identify the people who taught Lenin English, and all three of them appear to be English surnames, at least, and Englishmen. And in Krupskaya's recollections of Lenin, she clearly says that it was two Englishmen who taught them English. We know he spoke English with H.G. Wells, and there was also the British intelligence. He was an early British spy. His name escapes me now. It'll be somewhere in my notes. Lockhart. And Lenin spoke English with both of them, and neither of them mentioned anything approaching an Irish accent. We know. I think it's Albert Rhys Williams. I think was Welsh, with a name like that. He said Lenin spoke in a very over courteous manner. He was very polite. He was very formal when he spoke English, and he spoke English like someone who had read it out of a book. In that respect, we also know Lenin was a mimic. We know that he would imitate a Scottish accent. In one of the debates of the Second Congress, Willie Gallagher from the Scottish delegation kicked off and had a go at Lenin because of what Lenin had put in left-wing communism, an infantile disorder. And later on, when Lenin's retelling the story, he mimics the accent, and everyone's impressed about how he is able to do it so readily. I found one kernel of truth, which I think is where the myth might have grown up from, and it's in Krupskaya's recollections of Lenin. And it's that when they were learning English, they would often go to Hyde Park Corner and listen to the speakers. And she says that their favourite speaker, when they did that, was an Irishman, and that they liked to listen to him because the Irish accent was easier for them to understand than the English accent. So whatever about did Lenin speak with an Irish accent, we do know that he understood the Irish accent. And I think fundamentally, to the point of today's conversation, he understood the Irish struggle and he understood the Irish desire for national liberation. So that's the true story of Lenin's voice.
It's brilliant. Thank you very much, Joe. It's been a really, really interesting session and some fantastic stuff we've learned there. I also want to say thanks again, everyone, for taking part and watching this event. And finally, before we go, please do consider donating or getting a ticket for the rest of the Lenin 100 series. Thanks very much.
Thank you.